Alright, Ninja Nerds, in this video we're going to talk about the cranial nerves. If you guys have watched our videos on the cranial nerves, we covered each one individually in heavy detail. So now what I want to do is get a nice little brief overview, a nice little recap of those nerves. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. So in this video we're going to talk about each nerve individually, again, but we're only going to have a little brief recap. We're going to talk about where's the origin of the nerve, what's the structures that are being supplied, what are the fibers that it contains, what's the function, and then we're going to finish up with, is it sensory, motor, or both? And we'll also talk a little bit about the actual, a little bit of clinical anatomy via the what hole in the skull it's actually moving through. Okay? So let's go ahead and get started. First one, olfactory nerve. Where are you going to find these nerves? Well, if you guys remember, we said that the immotile cilia are going to be in the nasal cavity, the roof of the nasal cavity. So in the roof of the nasal cavity is where we're going to find this nerve. They also call it the olfactory mucosa. So we can find it within the roof of the nasal cavity. Now, what are the structures being supplied? The nasal cavity. It's that simple. So the structures that are being supplied is mainly going to be the nasal cavity. Because if you remember, it was located, these actual olfactory receptors were located within that olfactory epithelium and the roof of the nasal cavity. So it's supplying the nasal cavity. Now, what type of fibers does it contain? It's very special. These fibers are so special and they're so visceral and they're taking information into the central nervous system. So it's special visceral afferent fibers. Okay, so it consists of what's called SVA fibers. What does that stand for? Special visceral afferent fibers. There's only two examples in the body of special visceral afferents. One is going to be olfactory and the other one is going to be the gustation, okay, the gustation pathway that we talked about. All right, so what is its function? It's for olfaction, but we're not going to say it like that. We're going to say it a little bit more simple, smell. So it's picking up different types of odors. So its function is for smell. Now, since that's the case, whenever there is the odorants activating these olfactory receptors within the roof of the nasal cavity, these SVA fibers are activated, they're taking the smell to the central nervous system. So because of that, it's only taking sensory information. So because of that, we're going to circle here saying it's only going to be a sensory nerve. Now, how does it get to the actual central nervous system? By what hole in the skull is it moving through? It's moving through a bunch of different little holes within the ethmoid bone. You know there's what's called the olfactory foramina, which are a bunch of different holes within what's called the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. So it's moving through the olfactory foramina of the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. Okay? Now, olfactory nerves are found within the actual receptors are found within the roof of the nasal cavity and the olfactory epithelium. They're serving the nasal cavity. They're picking up odorants. Okay, so smell, olfaction, it's moving by the way of SVA, special visceral afferent fibers. They're a sensory nerve. They're moving through the olfactory foramina of the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone, and then eventually they're going to take this information to a special structure called the olfactory bulb. Okay, so they're going to take it to an area right underneath the frontal lobe, okay, within what's called the olfactory groove. It's going to take it to what's called the olfactory bulb. And then from here, there's mitral cells and glomeruli, and it'll have the olfactory tracts that'll take it to different areas within inside of the brain, okay? To basically allow for us to be consciously aware of those different types of smells. All right, and it could take it to other different types of limbic nuclei, the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, other different areas. We discussed that. Sweet deal, that's that bad boy. Now let's come over here and let's do the optic nerve, cranial nerve II. Okay, origin, very, very similar. Origin is going to be found within what's called the retina, okay? So you're going to have what's called, we actually made a video on the optic nerve, right, where we talked about the ganglion cells, the axons of those ganglion cells. Those axons of the ganglion cells were located within the retina. That is what's making up the optic nerve. So what would you actually say the origin is? It's technically in the retina. Okay, what structures is it supplying? It's supplying the eye, but specifically it's picking up information from what? The photoreceptors, the rods, the cones, and even the ganglion cells, which are containing the pigment called melanopsin. So what structures are really being supplied? We should really be specific and say within the retina, it's actually picking it up from photoreceptors. So photoreceptors. If we're really being specific, it'd actually be supplying the photoreceptors within the retina, rods, cones, and ganglion cells with the melanopsin. What type of fibers is it? These are very special, and they're taking sensory information to the central nervous system. So it's a special sensory afferent, okay? So it's a special sensory afferent, okay? So again, fibers are actually going to originate in the retina. They're supplying the photoreceptors, rods, cones, and the ganglion cells with melanopsin. They're carrying this information on the special sensory afferent fibers. What's their function? To allow for vision, okay? To allow for vision. So since it's only carrying sensory information, there's no muscles, there's no glands being involved in this area, it's primarily going to be a sensory nerve, okay? So a sensory nerve. Now, as it's taking this actual visual information, what it's going to do is it's going to go through a hole within the skull. What is that hole called? It's actually located within the posterior part of the orbital cavity. It is called the optic canal, okay? So it's going to move through the optic canal along with the ophthalmic artery, and eventually these fibers will go to an area what's called the optic chiasma, where some of the fibers will cross. We discussed that into detail. Then from there, they'll eventually go to another area called the lateral geniculate nucleus, where they'll be sent to the occipital lobe, where the primary visual cortex is, okay? Where the perception of the sensation is occurring, where what we see becomes real, okay? All right, that's that guy. All right, next one, oculomotor nerve, third cranial nerve. This guy's really cool, okay? His origin, because he's actually very interesting, his origin is located within the midbrain. We're only going to talk about the main part. We're not going to go into super neuroanatomy detail. We're going to say just what part of the brainstem would you find it in. For him, he's going to be found in the midbrain. His nucleus is located within the midbrain, two of the nuclei. If you really wanted to know, we already said it was at the level of the superior colliculus. That's good enough, okay? Now, what type of structures is it supplying? It's supplying a lot of different extraocular eye muscles. Okay, so let's go ahead and write down which ones, and I'll give you a lot of like acronym towards the end here of what it actually serves, how you can make it a little easier for yourself. So one is going to be the superior rectus. This is a big one, okay? So superior rectus. Another one it's going to supply is what's called the levator palpebra superioris, okay? Another one that it's going to supply is called the inferior rectus. Another one is going to be the inferior oblique. And another really important one is going to be the medial rectus. But we're not done, because you want to know what's really interesting? The midbrain, okay, the oculomotor nerve, which is located within the midbrain, it has two different types of fibers, okay? One type of fiber is going to be what's called GSE, and another really interesting one called GVE fibers. The GSE fibers stand for general somatic efferents. That's the somatomotor ones. Those are the ones that are going to the superior rectus, levator palpebra superioris, inferior rectus, inferior oblique, and medial rectus. The GVE is the parasympathetic fibers from the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, which is taking that information to the ciliary ganglion, which is doing what? If you remember, that was controlling the pupil, and it was controlling the ciliaris muscle, basically the accommodation and the pupil constriction response. So what else is really being supplied by this nerve then? We could also say that it's supplying the pupil, specifically the sphincter pupillae, and it's supplying another muscle called the ciliaris, okay? Okay, so what is its function? We're just going to say eye movement. If we really want to be specific, if it's controlling the superior rectus, that's elevating the eye, right? If it's the levator palpebra superioris, it's elevating the upper eyelid. So we can say eye movement and eyelid movement. And it's controlling accommodation, which is basically when the ciliaris contracts, it changes the shape of the lens. And it controls pupil size. So whenever it's these parasympathetic fibers, these GVE fibers innervate the pupil, it causes the pupil to constrict. When the ciliaris contracts, it plays a role within near vision. Okay? That's that guy. Okay? And again, if it's the inferior rectus, he depresses the eyeball, medially rotates. Superior rectus elevates the eyeball, medially rotates. Inferior oblique elevates the eyeball, laterally rotates. Medial rectus medially rotates. And again, it causes constriction of the pupil, and it causes the contraction of the ciliaris to play a role specifically within the lens by making the lens more accommodated for specifically certain types of vision, and that vision is going to be near vision, okay? By making the lens more globular. All right, now what hole in the skull is this actual nerve going to be moving through? Oh, before I do that, what is it? Sensory, motor, or both? Okay, well if you think about it, it's really only carrying efferent fibers out. Since it's really only carrying the efferent fibers out, it's not picking up any sensations. So because of that, this is primarily a motor nerve. And it's moving through a hole within the skull. If you guys remember, we called it the superior. I'm going to abbreviate it here. Actually, I can fit it in here. Orbital fissure. Inside of the common tendinous ring, if you remember. Okay? Sweet deal. That one's done. Let's move on to the next guy, the trochlear nerve, this green one. So it's coming here, boom. Trochlear nerve, where would it be located? Its origin. The trochlear nerve is a very interesting nerve. Again, it's located within the midbrain. So it's located within the midbrain, but if you guys remember, we said it was at the level of the inferior colliculus. We said that they actually cross, coming from behind the midbrain and out the sides. Okay, so now we know it's coming out of the midbrain. What are some of the structures that it's supplying? It's supplying a specific extraocular eye muscle. This muscle is called the superior oblique. And the superior oblique is a very interesting muscle because whenever it contracts, it actually depresses the eyeball and laterally rotates it. Okay? I'm going to show you these on these models whenever we talk about abducens so we can put them all together. Okay, what type of fibers is it carrying? Well, it's really only having a muscle fiber. And it's not special, it's general. So it's a general somatic, okay, because it's supplying a skeletal muscle, efferent, because the information is coming out of the central nervous system. So therefore, this is only going to be a motor neuron. Okay, so it's a motor nerve. Function, it's going to control eye movement, okay? And again, what type of eye movement? If we're being specific here, superior oblique pulls the eyeball down so it depresses it and laterally rotates it. Now, this nerve, as it's moving and moving and moving, what hole is it actually moving through to get to the orbital cavity? It's moving through the same hole as the actual third cranial nerve, except it's running outside of the common tendinous ring. But it's specifically moving through a hole called the superior orbital fissure. And again, it's moving outside of that common tendinous ring, or the annulus of Zinn, which was where the origin of the superior rectus, inferior rectus, lateral rectus, and medial rectus is. Okay? And same thing here, if we follow a third nerve, remember here was the third nerve, the pink one, it comes right here in the middle part of the midbrain. It comes out around the interpeduncular fossa. The fourth nerve is coming out a little bit more on the lateral sides of the midbrain. Okay? Sweet deal. That's that one. Now let's move on to the beast. This guy is a beast. If you guys watched our trigeminal nerve video, I can't thank you enough, because that one was a monster, right? But trigeminal nerve is a very, very interesting nerve. Where are we going to find its origin? Its origin is primarily located within the pons, right? But remember, we had that thing called a trigeminal ganglion, okay? But here's what's really interesting. Remember we said that the trigeminal nerve, there was a couple different things. It had different nuclei. So it had what's called a mesencephalic nucleus, right? I'm going to put mesencephalic nucleus, right? That was located within the midbrain. I'm going to put MB for midbrain. If you also remember, it had what's called the principal pontine nucleus. If you remember, that was in the pons. And then it had that really, really important one, which was specifically called the spinal nucleus, right? And that one was located within the medulla and even a little bit within the spinal cord. But then there was also another point of origin there. Remember, we also had, these were for a lot of the sensory fibers. We also had the trigeminal motor nucleus that was also located primarily within the pons. I'm going to put trigeminal motor nucleus, which was primarily located within the pons. And then it had that trigeminal ganglion, which was located right on the actual petrous part of the temporal bone. So that's good enough. So remember, mesencephalic nucleus is in the midbrain, principal pontine nucleus was in the pons, spinal nucleus of the trigeminal system was in the medulla and had a little extension into the spinal cord, and the trigeminal motor nucleus is going to be in the pons. And if you want to remember, the ganglion was located right there on the petrous part of the temporal bone within the middle cranial fossa. Okay, so what are the structures supplied? Holy crap, it supplies so much. To hit every single thing, it's unbelievable. We're going to really dumb this down here. Okay, so if we look, it has one branch which is called an ophthalmic branch. That's going to supply a lot of skin of the scalp. Okay, the actual palpebra, so the eyelids, the conjunctiva, even supply the actual skin of the scalp on the actual temporal side, the forehead, some of the actual parts of the on top of the head up to the vertex, so many different areas. It can supply the actual skin of around the ears, so it can even supply the actual external ear. It can even supply the skin around the actual chin. It can supply the skin around the chin, the skin around the cheek, skin around the jaw. Oh my goodness, you can supply so much. So you can even supply skin of what? He can supply the skin of the jaw, the chin, even the nose. He can even supply the actual skin of the nose. He even can supply, oh my goodness, he can supply so much. He can supply some of the internal cavities within the nasal cavity. So he can supply the nasal cavity. He can supply the oral cavity, okay? So he can even supply nasal cavity and oral cavity. Wow, but that's not even it yet. So it can supply so much. It can basically supply pretty much the entire face. But another thing that it's actually doing, so it's supplying the skin of the scalp, the eyelids, the conjunctiva, the external ear, the skin of the jaw, the chin, the nose, the nasal cavity, the oral cavity. It even can give some actual supply to muscles. What muscles? Okay. These muscles that it's going to supply here are called the muscles of mastication. The chewing muscles. It also supplies two other muscles. One of those is called the tensor tympani, which if you guys remember, it pulled on the malleus medially to tense the tympanic membrane to dampen some of the sounds from chewing. Another one was called the tensor villi palatini, which basically tensed the actual soft palate to help in the process of the actual chewing, to help to kind of pull up the pharynx a little bit, right? So these were some of the muscles that it's supplying, and that was coming from the trigeminal motor nucleus in the pons. Okay, so what is it supplying? It's supplying so many different structures, the skin, the mucous membranes of what? The scalp, the eyelids, the conjunctiva, the external ear, the skin of the jaw, the chin, the nose, the nasal cavity, oral cavity, many different things. It even can supply the orbital cavity. So it can even supply the orbital cavity, the nasopharynx, even a little bit of the pharyngotympanic tube, the tonsils, so much. It can even supply the tongue. Let's see if we can fit that in there. We can even supply the tongue. Okay, put it right here. Okay, that's good enough. It supplies a lot of different structures. Now, what are the fibers? Okay, since it supplies motor fibers, you would think, oh, it's probably just the GSE. No. Unfortunately, since the muscles that this guy serves, the muscles of mastication, tensor tympani, tensor villi palatini, these were actually derived from what's called the first pharyngeal arch. So because of that, it's going to contain special visceral efferent fibers. Also, because it's picking up touch, pain, temperature from all, and proprioception and pressure from all of these different areas, it's going to have what's called general somatic afferent fibers. So the touch, pain, temperature that supplies the skin of the scalp, eyelids, conjunctiva, external ear, skin of the jaw, chin, nose, nasal cavity, oral cavity, tongue, all those different things. What's its function? We already said. It's to pick up sensations of touch, pain, temperature, pressure, and even mastication muscles. So it's to be able to provide mastication muscles, okay, for chewing. All right? So a lot of different functions for this guy. And then We know that it picks up sensations from all of these different areas, and we know that it supplies the muscles of mastication, tensor tympani, tensor veli palatini. So it's not just sensory, it's not just motor, it contains both fibers. So this is containing both fibers. Then, if that wasn't complicated enough, it also, these has 3 different branches, okay? We said that there's what's called a V1 branch, which is the ophthalmic division, a V2 branch, which is the actual maxillary division, and a V3 branch, which is the mandibular division. Each one of these branches goes through a different hole within the skull. One, I'm going to abbreviate them, is the superior orbital fissure. That's for the V1, the ophthalmic division, okay? And it actually moves specifically, most of the branches move through the supraorbital fissure outside of the common tendinous ring. V2 is actually going to be moving through a specific structure called the foramen rotundum. I'm going to put FR there. And V3 moves through what's called the foramen ovale into what's called the infratemporal fossa. Then, if you remember, the motor fibers are only here, I'll kind of put here, I'll star it, the motor fibers here are only really running in V3, the mandibular branch. But if you remember, the sensory fibers are bringing the information into this big old structure here with the cell bodies of the, remember that specifically we called the cell bodies of this actual nerve? It was called the trigeminal ganglion. And then from there it can send it into the mesencephalic nucleus, the principal pontine nucleus, or down into the spinal nucleus. Okay, that's good enough. All right, now we come to the last one over here, the abducens nerve, 6th cranial nerve. This guy's origin is located within the pons. So it's a little bit more of the inferior pons. If you guys remember, we said that the facial nerve actually kind of runs around the abducens nerve, so we can say we can find it at the level of what's called the facial colliculus, if you remember. What structures this is supplying? It's very, very simple. It's only supplying one muscle within the orbital cavity called the actual lateral rectus. So it's supplying a muscle called the lateral rectus. What type of fibers does it have then? Well, so since it's applying an extraocular eye muscle, those are called GSE fibers, general somatic efferent fibers. What is its function? Eye movement. Particularly the lateral rectus causes lateral rotation of the eye or abduction of the eye. Okay, but again, we're just going to put here for right now to keep it very simple, eye movement. But again, keep in your minds very clearly that the lateral rectus does lateral rotation or abduction of the eye. Then, since it's only carrying motor fibers, this is going to be a motor nerve. Now in reality, the abducens nerve and some of the other nerves have minor sensory proprioceptive fibers, but we're not going to consider that to be significant enough, so we primarily consider him to be a motor nerve. What hole does he run in within the skull? He runs in what's called the superior orbital fissure, but inside of the common tendinous ring or the annulus of Zen. Okay, that's that guy. Now, I told you I was going to give you a little acronym that's going to help out a little bit with being able to remember these extraocular eye muscles and which nerve supplies which. So an easy way to remember, let's actually write it up here. You can remember LR6, SO4, ATR3. How does this go? Lateral rectus supplies the 6th cranial nerve. So if you're looking at the actual eyeball, okay, if you kind of want to get a little orientation of the muscles, for example, this is actually the lateral rectus. This one right here is the inferior oblique. This one right here is called the inferior rectus. This one over in the back side is the medial rectus, because this is the nasal side going into the board. Coming out from the board is the actual ear side, right? Or the temple side, whatever you want to call it. This right here is the superior rectus, and this one right above it is called the levator palpebra superiors, and I'm abbreviating them, okay, because we already talked about them. So lateral rectus is supplied by the 6th cranial nerve. So this one you can remember, 6th cranial nerve. Okay, sweet. SO4, superior oblique. You can't really see it in this one, that's why we have another diagram for you. If we come down here to the bottom, we're looking at the eye from the anterior view. That one over there was from the lateral view. Okay? So specifically, if you're looking at this from the anterior view, just to give it a little orientation, this is the medial side, this is the lateral side. So this would be medial rectus, this would be inferior rectus, this would be lateral rectus, and superior rectus. And then just to get a little bit more, inferior oblique right here, and this bad boy right here is called the superior oblique. So the superior oblique is actually running through this little bony part here called the trochlea. It comes through the trochlea and attaches into the posterior and lateral aspect of the eyeball. Now, Because of that, whenever it pulls downward and outward. But again, SO4, superior oblique, which supplies this one, the fourth cranial nerve. Okay? And then if you want, since we're already down here, might as well hit that. ATR3, what does that stand for? All the rest is supplied by the third cranial nerve. So which ones? Superior rectus. What else? Inferior rectus. Inferior oblique. Okay? And again, who supplies lateral rectus? Just because since we're here. Sixth cranial nerve supplies lateral rectus. So you guys remember LR6. To get the rest of them, levator palpebrae superioris. And again, superior rectus, medial rectus, inferior oblique, and inferior rectus. These are all supplied by the third cranial nerve. Okay? Sweet deal. All right, and again, following this guy in. If we follow the sixth cranial nerve, as it's actually moving this way, because again, it's motor. But if we wanted to see where it's actually coming out, it's coming out right around this pons medulla junction. Okay, so here's your pons, this is the medulla. It's coming right around that actual sulcus or that junction between the two, but the most medial part of it. Okay? All right, so sweet. How will we recognize this one? You can do it, remember, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. All right, sweet. So that covers everything on this side, but we're going to keep going because remember, there's actually 12 pairs of cranial nerves, okay? So now we have to hit the other parts of them, okay? So you would see the same thing on the other side here for 1, 2, and again 3, 4, 5, 6. Now what we're going to do is we're just going to continue on with 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. All right, so let's go on to the next one, facial nerve. This is another beast, okay? Origin of the facial nerve. You can actually primarily find this within the pons, okay? So primarily within the pons. Now remember, this has many different nuclei for the facial nerve, okay? There's a bunch of different types of nuclei that we could talk about here. We're not going to do that since we already discussed them in great detail. So just remember for right now that the facial nerve is going to be located within the pons, but there is many, many nuclei. Okay, so what are the structures that are going to be supplied by the facial nerve? Easy way to just remember it is it supplies the muscles of facial expression, okay? So muscles of facial expression. That's the easy one to remember, okay? Another one is it also is going to supply another little muscle inside of the middle ear cavity called the stapedius, which is basically a muscle that plays a role whenever it contracts. It actually helps to dampen some of the tapping of the stapes on the oval window to prevent excessive sounds, right? Because if it's damaged, like in Bell's palsy we talked about, it can cause hyperacusis, a very, very sensitiveness to the sound waves. Okay, but also, if you remember, this was the actual motor fibers. It also supplied the digastric muscles too. If you remember, we talked about this, it supplied other muscles too. We specifically said that it supplied the digastric muscles and it even supplied the actual stylohyoid, okay? Okay, so now what else? It's also supplying specific glands. It's supplying specific glands. What glands is it supplying? If you remember, we said that it's specifically supplying the lacrimal glands. So it's supplying the lacrimal glands. Supplying the lacrimal glands. What else is it supplying? It's also supplying another part here. We also said that it's supplying the actual nasal glands. Okay, so it's supplying the nasal glands. And we also said it's supplying some little glands inside of the actual, around the palate, so the palatine glands. What else is it doing? It's picking up taste. So it's picking up taste from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. So it's picking up taste. So it's supplying the anterior 2/3 of tongue. What else is it doing? This guy does so much, right? He's also giving a little bit of supply to the actual tympanic membrane and even the ear. So it's also supplying a little bit of the ear and a little bit of the tympanic membrane. All right, that should be good enough there, right? Okay, so what are the fibers then? So again, it supplies muscles of facial expression, stapedius, lacrimal glands, nasal glands, palatine glands, anterior 2/3 of the tongue, and even the ear. The fibers, it has so many different fibers. Since it's supplying the muscles of facial expression and stapedius, these are actually muscles that are derived from the second pharyngeal arch. So because of that, these are SVE fibers. It supplies the lacrimal and the nasal and the palatine glands. So these are secretomotor fibers, or parasympathetic fibers. So these are GVE fibers. It also is going to be picking up what? Taste from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. So gustation, that is a special visceral afferent fibers. And it's also going to supply touch, pain, temperature fibers to the tympanic membrane and the external ear. That is GSA fibers. So what does this function? It controls the muscles of facial expression. So all of those muscles that control your facial expression, that's what it's doing. So again, we can say muscles of facial expression. I'm not going to go through every single one of them, but I remember the branches of it. We actually talked about it. We had the temporal, we had the actual zygomatic, we had the buccal, we had the marginomandibular, and we had the cervical. We talked about each branch. It's also going to cause secretions. So it's going to cause lacrimation, which is production of tears. It's going to cause nasal and palatine gland mucus production, right? So it's going to cause secretion. We're just going to put secretion here in general. And it's going to pick up taste, and it's also going to pick up touch, pain, temperature from the external ear and the tympanic membrane. So it's also going to pick up touch, pain, and temperature from ear. Make it simple, right? Okay, so because of that, it's picking up sensations from the tongue and from the ear, external ear. And it's providing secretomotor and muscle fibers. Okay, so fibers that are going to the actual muscles. So because of that, it has sensory fibers and motor fibers. So it contains both. Now this guy is a little tricky one because he actually moves through two different holes. One hole where the main components of the facial nerve, because there's actually two components, the nervus intermedius and the facial nerve proper. Facial nerve proper is the motor one. It moves through two holes, so we're going to just highlight this as two holes. The first one it moves through is what's called the internal acoustic meatus. This is the main one, okay? But then some of the fibers that are going to go to the muscles of facial expression and even the digastric, right? So they're going to go to the digastric muscles and even a little bit of the stylohyoid. This is actually going to be specifically the stylomastoid foramen. Okay? All right, that's that. Sweet deal, that covers that guy. That covers the facial nerve. He is a beast. Now, where is he actually coming? If we follow him. If we follow this guy, the motor and sensory fibers that were moving through those two holes, they're going to come right here at the level of the pons medulla junction, lateral to the abducens nerve, and medial, a little bit more medial and superior to this next nerve here, what we're going to talk about, called the vestibulocochlear nerve, or cranial nerve VIII. Okay, so now we go into the cranial nerve VIII, vestibulocochlear nerve. All right, so this guy, where are you going to find him? He's really interesting because we'll talk about this one in more detail in the vestibulocochlear nerve, that we know that we're actually going to find it within the pons. Some of the nuclei are located within the pons, the lower pons, and some nuclei are actually located within the actual medulla. So because of that, we say it's right on that pons medulla border or junction. Okay, so we really say that its origin is actually located what's called the pons medulla junction or border. I'm going to put junction. Okay, and again, it's because you have what's called cochlear nuclei, you have vestibular nuclei, and because a lot of those guys are intersecting right around that pons medulla area, we just say it's at the pons medulla junction for the origin. So structures that are supplied, it's mainly going to supply the inner ear. But okay, what part of the inner ear? If we're saying for the vestibular portion, because you know there's two branches of the vestibulocochlear nerve, the vestibular branch and the cochlear branch. Let's say that we do the vestibular branch first. The vestibular branch supplies primarily what's called the vestibule. And inside of the vestibule, there's an area called the macula, which is actually found within the utricle and the saccule, and that's for static equilibrium, right? So vertical and horizontal acceleration or deceleration. We also said that it's also going to supply another part, right, that are actually coming off the vestibule, called the semicircular canals, with inside of the semicircular canals. So there's an area called in the semicircular canals, which is actually consisting of the semicircular ducts, which consist of the cristae ampullaris, and the cristae ampullaris is for dynamic equilibrium, or rotational acceleration, right? Moving your head from side to side, or spinning around, okay? And the last one is it's going to supply another structure. This is the cochlear branch now. The cochlear branch of the vestibulocochlear nerve supplies the cochlea. Okay, so it supplies the cochlea. Specific part of the cochlea is what's called the cochlear duct. That's where you actually have what's called the spiral organ of Corti, and it's picking up sound waves, okay? So basically auditory sensations. Now, what type of fibers are these? Because the vestibulocochlear nerve is so special, and it's taking sensory information into the central nervous system, it's a special sensory afferent, okay? So it's a special sensory afferent fibers. Okay? The only two special sensory afferent is going to be the optic and the vestibulocochlear. Special visceral afferent is olfactory and gustation. What is its function? If it's supplying the vestibule and the semicircular canals, it's basically, these are playing a role within your balance, your equilibrium. So we said vestibule, where the macula is for static equilibrium. Your static equilibrium. Maintaining your balance and your posture, basically, right? And then for the semicircular canals, right, where the crista ampullaris is, this is for your dynamic equilibrium. So for a dynamic equilibrium, and a lot for your eye movements. And actually, there's a lot of eye movements, what's called a vestibulo-ocular reflex. We'll talk about that in the vestibulocochlear nerve. All right, and then another thing is the cochlea, and cochlea is just for sound. So this is picking up sound waves. Whatever you, when I'm talking to you guys through the camera right now, you guys are hearing me because of the sound waves compressing on the different parts of the cochlea. We're not going to go into detail on that now. Okay, so that's its function: static equilibrium, dynamic equilibrium, and sound. We'll go into more detail in that actual individual nerve. Here's what's really weird though. People are like, oh, it's only going to be sensory fibers. That is true. It's primarily a sensory nerve. But there's something really weird. There is efferent fibers that can go to specific hair cells, okay, that can actually cause these hair cells to contract. Specifically, we'll talk about them like the outer hair cells. They contain proteins called brainstem that can actually contract and play a role within accentuating what's called the bowing of the basilar membrane. So because of that, they do play a little bit of a motor role. So I'm going to put down here that they're both, but remember, I'm going to asterisk this right here. It's primarily a sensory nerve. Okay, but it does have efferent fibers that are going there to control contraction of what's called the outer hair cells, which contain a protein called brainstem, which can play a role within the upward bowing or downward bowing of the basilar membrane. So it has some efferent fibers. Okay, but again, it's primarily a sensory nerve. But just because of whatever's written in the literature, I'm going to put down both. All right, now, when it's moving, these actual sensory fibers and motor fibers, what hole is it actually moving through within the skull? There's a hole located within that petrous part of the temporal bone called the internal acoustic meatus. Guess who else runs down that hole? The facial nerve, right? So the facial nerve is also running in the same hole as the vestibulocochlear nerve. But again, the facial nerve can come out through the stylomastoid foramen, right, and give some supply again to we said muscles of facial expression, the stylohyoid and the digastric posterior belly, we said. Same thing for this guy. He can move through the internal acoustic meatus. And where does he go? He'll take this information to right around the actual pons medulla junction. It depends on what branch. If it's the vestibular branch, he'll take it to what's called vestibular nuclei. If he takes it to what's called the cochlear branch, he'll take it to cochlear nuclei. We'll talk about that individually in those videos. All right, sweet deal. We did the vestibulocochlear nerve. Now let's go over here to glossopharyngeal nerve. This guy's a really cool one too because his origin is primarily within the medulla. Okay, so his origin is primarily inside of the medulla oblongata, right, within the actual brainstem. Now, this guy has many, many nuclei also. We discussed him in great detail. Many nuclei. We're not going to go into every single nuclei. We're going to say it's located within the medulla of the brainstem, the main nuclei. What structures does it supply? It supplies a boo-goo amount of structures. But to make it easier, I'm going to write down the fibers, and I'm going to correlate it with the structures that are supplied. And then the functions are basically the same. So it has what's called SVE fibers. Okay? Special visceral efferent fibers. These are fibers that are going to one muscle, just one muscle within the actual palate and then within the pharynx area. This muscle is called the stylopharyngeus. Okay, so I'm going to put stylopharyngeus. It also has GVA fibers, general visceral afferent fibers. This one's interesting because it's taking touch, pain, temperature, a lot of different types of sensations, visceral sensations, from the oral cavity, specifically the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, the tonsils, the actual pharynx, the soft palate, and even a little bit of the actual nasopharynx too, right? Okay, so this guy, like the pharyngotympanic tube. So because of that, he's actually going to pick up, he's going to supply like the pharynx, soft palate, tonsils, and even the tongue. Another area that he supplies, he gives what's called GSA fibers. And these GSA fibers are actually going to go to supply a part of the tympanic membrane, okay, some of the inner part of the tympanic membrane, and it might even give a little bit of branches that go into the external ear, okay? So it can also supply the ear via these what's called GSA fibers. That's not it though. It even has another one called GVE fibers, general visceral efferent fibers. These are secretomotor fibers that go to what's called the otic ganglion, right, via the lesser petrosal nerve, and we said that this supplies the parotid gland. So let's throw this one up here also, the parotid gland, okay? And it even has other GVA fibers that I didn't mention here that actually go to what's called the carotid sinus. So it can actually pick up what's called the baroreceptors. We have baroreceptors, and we also have chemoreceptors within the carotid bodies and the carotid sinuses. So it also can supply, I'm going to put here carotid branch, okay? And it even can go and supply sensory information with the vagus nerve via the pharyngeal plexus to supply some sensory fibers to the pharynx and even the soft palate also. So when you talk about his function, he does a heck of a lot. The stylopharyngeus can actually help to pull the pharynx upwards. So one is it can actually elevate pharynx. I'm going to put elevate pharynx, represented with the up arrow. It also is going to pick up touch, pain, temperature for the ear. Okay, so I'm going to put touch, pain, temp for ear. And it's also going to pick up touch, pain, temperature from the actual soft palate, the actual tonsils, the tongue, and even the pharynx. So we can put here with it pharynx, soft palate. I'm going to put soft palate here, tongue, and what else? Ooh, forgot another one. Special visceral afferent. Special visceral afferent are basically taste fibers. So because it also supplies the tongue, it also picks up taste from the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. And if you remember, it also picks up information from the carotid branches. So it picks up information on what's called the partial pressure of oxygen, the partial pressure of CO2, our pH arterial-wise, and it also picks information up on our blood pressure. So if our blood pressure is too high, blood pressure is too low, it can regulate that and send that information into the medulla, which can control certain centers within inside of the medulla via the cardiac acceleratory and the cardiac inhibitory center, and even the vasomotor center. All right, so that should be good enough there for the glossopharyngeal nerve for all of these different things, okay? So because it has GVE fibers and SVE fibers, along with GVA, GSA, SVA, these are the sensory, this is the motor. So it has sensory and motor, therefore it is containing a mixed. It's a mixed nerve, it has both. This guy, if we follow him, where all these SVA fibers, SVE, GVA, GSA, GVE, so many different things, OMG, right? It moves through a specific hole within the skull, okay? This is called the jugular foramen. A lot of different structures run within that same hole, like the vagus and the accessory nerve. Okay, we did that one. Let's do the vagus now. Okay, holy frick knuckles, there's a lot of these, right? So vagus is very, very interesting. He's probably going to be one of the more intense ones. So the origin of the vagus nerve is also within the medulla. Okay, so this is also going to be found within the medulla oblongata. And again, this has many, many different nuclei that we discussed in great detail in the individual video. What are some of the structures that it supplies? Okay, get ready. So it can supply so many different things. It can supply the pharynx. It can supply the larynx. It can supply the heart. I'm not going to write down every single organ. I'm going to put down a lot of the thoracic and abdominal viscera. Okay, that covers a lot of different areas. So it can supply what's called the thoracic viscera, and I'll mention them: heart, lungs, and it can supply the abdominal viscera. Like, what do I mean? It can supply the actual stomach, it can supply the esophagus, it can supply the liver, it can supply the gallbladder, it can supply the spleen, it can supply the pancreas, it can supply the kidneys, many, many different areas. Even the small intestine, large intestine, primarily the cecum, ascending colon, transverse colon, but where do we say it stops? It stops either at the splenic flexure, and some literature says around the 2/3 of the transverse colon. Okay? Tons of different areas within the thoracic viscera. What else does it supply? It's also going to have supply that's going to go to the epiglottis. If you remember, we have what's called the epiglottis and a little bit of taste buds within the pharynx and a little bit in the soft palate. It's picking up that information, but we said it's primarily from the epiglottis. Okay, it also can supply the ear. So we also said it can supply the ear, the external ear, and even a little bit of the actual tympanic membrane. Many different structures there. Now, basically, what kind of fibers would we have here? Okay, it has GVE fibers. These are secretomotor fibers. This is basically for the secretion and the contraction of a lot of the smooth muscle structures. Okay, so for example, secretion could be from a lot of the actual secretions within the actual abdominal viscera, from the GIT, right? So secretions of certain stomach acids, secretion of different types of mucus within an area, contraction of the actual small intestine or large intestine or stomach. Also, it's also going to be controlling the taste around the epiglottis, so that's SVA fibers. It's also going to be picking up touch, pain, temperature from the ear, so that's going to have GSA fibers. It's also going to be supplying the muscles of the pharynx and even the soft palate. Got to put that one in there, soft palate. This would actually be SVE fibers. And again, this is because we said that the glossopharyngeal nerve also has SVE fibers. It's actually derived from the third pharyngeal arch. The vagus is derived from what's called the fourth and the sixth pharyngeal arch. So he's supplying so many different muscles in the pharynx and the soft palate. And GVE, SVA, GSA, SVE, it's also going to have specifically GVA fibers. And that's because it also can supply the aortic arch. It supplies the aortic arch where there's what's called baroreceptors. So it actually can pick up specifically certain types of changes in blood pressure, and there's also what's called aortic bodies, which are basically picking up differences within the partial pressure of oxygen, CO2, and even the pH. So what is its function? Holy goodness, it can affect the heart. So if we say this, and basically if we go through every single thing, it can actually affect specifically many different functions. Here's what I'm going to say to make it a lot easier. I want you guys to just remember this. It is the main parasympathetic nerve. Main parasympathetic nerve. I don't want to take forever to go through every single thing on this because it'll just take so long. So what I want you to remember is that 90% of the parasympathetic outflow is carried by the vagus nerve. I'm going to mention really briefly, it can cause contractions of the pharynx, right? To help within what's called the deglutition process, where you're trying to swallow. It can play a role within the larynx, contraction of the larynx to basically play a role within voice production or phonation. It can actually affect the heart by trying to slow down the heart rate, okay? It can go to the thoracic viscera like the lungs to basically pick up certain types of sensations from the lungs, or basically cause secretions or constriction of the bronchial smooth muscle. It can go to the abdominal viscera, which are going to supply the esophagus for contractions. It can cause the stomach to contract, the intestines to contract. It can cause secretion of the stomach, secretions of the intestinal substances. It can affect the liver. It can affect the pancreas. So many different areas, the gallbladder. It can pick up taste from the epiglottis. It can pick up touch, pain, temperature from the ear. And even can supply some of the soft palate muscles. And it can pick up changes within the partial pressure of oxygen, the partial pressure of CO2, and the arterial pH. So many things. This guy is, you know, the vagus means vagabond. He's a wanderer because he freaking wanders everywhere in the body, okay? Because he's doing so much. So because of that, right away, don't even guess, he supplies so much, he's a mixed nerve, okay? Now this guy, if we follow him, where is he moving through in the skull? He moves through the same hole we said as the, ninth cranial nerve, and another one called the 11th cranial nerve. He's moving through what's called the jugular foramen also. Okay. We're going to fly through these bad boys because they're pretty simple. Accessory nerve. Where are you going to find his nucleus? The accessory nerve is primarily located within the medulla. He's actually he has a specific, two different parts. So we actually need to be very specific. We're going to put cranial part here. Part of the actual brainstem. This is actually coming from the medulla, where like the nucleus ambiguous is. But then we have an actual spinal component of the accessory nerve. And this is coming from the cervical spinal cord. Specifically from, we said C1 to C5 from the lateral funicular fibers, right? Okay, cool. What is the structures that it's supplying? Simple. Sternocleidomastoid, I'm going to put SCM, and the trapezius. And if you remember, these basically plays a role within He can play a role within flexion of the neck. He can play a role within ipsilateral flexion and contralateral rotation of the head. Trapezius elevates the scapula, retracts the scapula, and helps to stabilize some of the actual joint there, right? The actual shoulder joint. Fibers. It's primarily going to only be going to, now here's the thing, I got to actually be more specific too. Since the accessory nerve is actually has a cranial part within the medulla, a lot of the fibers from the cranial part go with the vagus nerve. So what I'm going to put here is I'm going to put here it's also a vagal component. Okay? Meaning that it can travel with the vagus nerve to supply a lot of the soft palate muscles in the pharynx. Okay? So fibers, primarily, we're mainly going to focus on these two. Okay, but again, it does have vagal components that can move to the pharynx and the soft palate. The fibers is primarily going to be GSE fibers. Okay, but because some of the actual fibers can go to the vagal components for the pharynx and the soft palate, I'm going to star it though, it can have some SVE components. It even has a little bit of proprioception too, but we're not going to even consider that because it's so minute. All right, function. Again, we said since it's supplying the sternocleidomastoid and the trapezius, these play a role within flexion of the neck, like for specifically the sternocleidomastoid, flexion of the neck. And again, it could be flexion, ipsilateral flexion, and it also can play within contralateral head rotation. So we'll put in there contralateral head rotation. And if it's the trapezius, he does what? He elevates scapula. And he also does what? He retracts the scapula. So he elevates and retracts the scapula. So we'll put here elevates and retracts scapula. Holy goodness, right? So because of that, he's mainly a motor nerve. Okay, because if he does go to the vagal components, he'll supply some of the actual muscles of the pharynx and the soft palate. Either way, that's a motor nerve. So he's not really having any sensory fibers. It's primarily a motor nerve. Now, if we follow this guy, got to be very, very kind of particular here. The cranial component, all right, specifically when he exits from the actual medulla, he moves through a hole within the skull called the jugular foramen. So he'll move within a hole in the skull called the jugular foramen. Now here's the tricky part. The spinal part from the cervical spinal cord, from like C1 to C5, it actually moves upwards and through the foramen magnum and then combines with some of the fibers from the actual cranial component of the accessory nerve. So remember, two holes that this actual nerve combined is moving through. One is the jugular foramen. That's from the, I'm going to put here C for the cranial part. The other one is going to be specifically for the, it's going to also move through the foramen magnum. And this is going to be the spinal part. But then remember, the spinal part fuses with the actual fibers from the cranial part and moves through the jugular foramen. So both, what? The spinal component and the cranial component can move through the jugular foramen. Okay, just so that we're clear. So spinal component moves up through the foramen magnum, combines with some of the cranial fibers, and moves out through the jugular foramen. Sweet deal. Last one. Holy crap, we're going to make it here, guys. Hypoglossal nerve. Where would it originate? This guy's also going to be located within the medulla. So the nuclei for the hypoglossal nerve is located within the medulla of the brainstem. Structures it supplies, keep it very simple. It supplies the extrinsic and intrinsic muscles of the tongue. We already went through every single one of these in great detail. We're not going to mention them again, okay? So now, if you remember basically the function of all of these muscles, they help, the intrinsic muscles of the tongue help to be able to change the shape of the tongue, right? So basically curl the tongue. Whereas the extrinsic help to be able to elevate the tongue, to retract the tongue, protract the tongue, all that different stuff, right? So they played a role within that different types of activity. So retraction, protraction, elevation, depression of the tongue. That was the extrinsic muscles of the tongue. So what type of fibers are these? Okay, so these are going to be primarily GSE fibers, general somatic efferent fibers. What is the function? We already said. So changing the shape of the tongue, so they can change the shape of the tongue, or they can protract, retract, elevate, and depress tongue. Okay. Now, it does have a little bit of sensory fibers from the meninges, but we don't consider that to be that significant. It's almost insignificant. So primarily, it's not going to have any sensory fibers. We consider it to primarily be a motor nerve. So because of that, he is only going to be carrying motor fibers considerably. All right. So again, hypoglossal, origin is in the medulla, goes to extrinsic and intrinsic muscles of the tongue. The fibers are primarily GSE fibers, and the muscles of the tongue control the shape of the tongue, protraction, retraction, elevation, and depression of the tongue. This nerve runs through a special hole within the skull, right where the actual occipital condyles are. There's a hole right within the occipital condyles here, and that hole is called the hypoglossal canal. Okay, so it moves through a little hole in that area called the hypoglossal canal. And just to finish it all off here, to kind of get an idea here again, we already did all of these. So again, this nerve right here would be facial nerve. So cranial nerve, 7. This brown one right here is the vestibulocochlear nerve. Cranial nerve, 8. This purple nerve right here is going to be glossopharyngeal nerve. Cranial nerve, 9. This green one here is going to be the vagus nerve. Cranial nerve, 10. This blue one here is the accessory nerve. Cranial nerve, 11. And this red one right here is actually going to be the hypoglossal nerve. Cranial nerve, 12. And again, going in order here, you can kind of see that the glossopharyngeal nerve is superior to the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is going to be a little bit more superior to the cranial component of the accessory nerve. And then the hypoglossal nerve is going to be medial to these guys, located right around that, what's called, remember these are the pyramids, olives. It's going to be right on that actual sulcus between the pyramids and the olives. All right, Ninja Nerds, so I just can't thank you guys enough for coming in and watching this video here on all the cranial nerves. I know it was a tad bit long, and I'm sorry for that, but I want you guys to understand that what we're trying to accomplish here at Ninja Nerd Science is to make these things really, really make sense, and sometimes that requires getting into the nitty-gritty details. So if you guys have watched all of the videos on all the cranial nerves, I can't thank you enough, but I want you guys to know that you guys are really, really going to know it now. And if you guys have gone over after learning all those brutal cranial nerves, you guys have hit the overview, I really feel it, and I guarantee it, that you guys will really, really understand the cranial nerves and have a strong base in it. Ninja Nerds, I really appreciate you guys sticking in there with me, hanging in there with me throughout all of these cranial nerves. Can't say a thank you enough. I hope it made sense. I really do hope that you guys enjoyed it. And if you guys did, please hit the like button, comment down in the comment section, and please subscribe. All right, Ninja Nerds, as always, until next time.